Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business. Hey, it's Michael Zapersky, and today I'm very excited to have Rita McGrath joining us. Rita, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Rita, for those who don't know you, just take a moment and explain what you do.
Sure. So I'm Rita McGrath. I'm a professor at Columbia Business School, as well as an author and a speaker, and sometimes a consultant.
All right. Well, your clients have included GE, Prudential, LinkedIn, Pernod Ricard, Cognizant, a whole bunch of other names that people know. But take us back. Let's kind of get started in the earlier days before you got into speaking and consulting. What did that look like? How did things begin for you?
Well, this part of my career had its start when I went to the Wharton School for my PhD. And we were fortunate. I worked in the Snyder Entrepreneurial Center there. And we were fortunate to be doing quite a lot at the time of what's called action research, meaning you're actually working with companies to learn what makes them work and not. And so my first couple of assignments were I ran a 3-year research program with Citibank. And they were interested in doing, and they funded our program for 3 years. And what they wanted us to do was create case studies of ventures that had succeeded and ventures that had not, and try to tease out from those case studies whether there were any lessons that could be learned to position them for greater success down the road. We also did some work for a Belgian mining company that was in the process of trying to transform themselves into more, 20th century industries and that sort of thing. And so it really began as part of my PhD research back in the day.
But here you are, you're still a PhD student. How do you leverage that experience into actually going out into business for yourself?
Well, I took the role as a professor at Columbia. And so in that environment, you're teaching students, you're taking courses, you have companies coming through. My colleague and I at Wharton continued to work together on joint client work. You'd go to conferences, you'd meet different executives there, or they'd read something that you wrote and say, oh, I have that issue as well. So we got a lot of interest in our work on discovery-driven planning, which was back in the 90s. And that was a pretty famous Harvard Business Review article, which essentially made the point that when you're planning for something that's highly uncertain, you can't plan the same way that you would if you were planning as though you had a platform of rich experience. And so the popularity of that article really is what got me then into the corporate venturing space, I guess. It was very popular. It became part of the toolkit that people really used when they're thinking about doing something that's new.
Do you think that having the platform of being a PhD student at Wharton was really one of the things, and also just, I guess, doing this research allowed you to get into organizations or to maybe have conversations that otherwise would have been challenging if you were just kind of out on your own as a consultant or looking to do work for the client directly without that type of positioning or backing?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a signal that you've done something and stuck to it long enough that you got the degree, you got the credential. I think a lot of the research work also, the process of doing a PhD teaches you a very disciplined way of solving problems. And it teaches you to be respectful of boundary conditions. And it teaches you, to really be careful about not confusing causality with correlation and a whole bunch of other really useful things. So from that perspective, the training really helps. But I think from what the angle is to the outside world, it's a marker that you've achieved something. It's credibility. If you want to go into business of medicine, it's just better off if you have a degree that says you know something about it.
Right. You would hope so, especially if someone's a surgeon and they're going to operate on you. It's nice to know that. So today your message focuses on creating an entrepreneurial mindset within organizations. Or at least that's kind of one of the key themes that I took from looking at your work. Tell us about what that means and why is having an entrepreneurial mindset, even if you're a part of an organization, why is that so important?
Well, I think it really begins with the changing nature of competitive advantage. So back in the day, when I was first doing my PhD, even then in the world of strategy, we had this idea that what you wanted to do was find an attractive industry and then set yourself up in an attractive position in that industry and then exploit your advantages for as long as you possibly could. And the holy grail was something called a sustainable competitive advantage. And what we've found over the subsequent years, and I would argue that digitization, globalization, these other forces that really have changed the world in which those theories were written, what we've seen is that competitive advantages are increasingly transient. And so what that means is you need to bring strategy and innovation together. And if you're going to do that, that also requires thinking like an entrepreneur. So thinking of what's the next advantage? How do I create consistent proficiency at innovation? How do I run things through my innovation pipeline in such a way that I can contribute to growth myself? And that's really as much about culture and mindset as it is about anything else. And so that's where the whole entrepreneurial mindset idea came from.
And so a lot of your work, or at least your focus in terms of working with organizations, is actually helping the organization to apply or benefit from the entrepreneurial mindset. In your experience, even in your own business, but looking at those around you as well, how do you feel that that mindset can be applied to, let's say, the independent professional, the consultant, the speaker, the person who's either just running themselves as the business or running a small team? How can they also benefit from that mindset?
Well, you've constantly got to be looking at where your next opportunity is from. You've got to make sure you're up to date and fresh. So that requires keeping on top of trends. It requires having that looking out into the future a little bit and making sure that you're not falling behind in terms of what's going on out there. I think one of the challenges I see, and I see this especially on the speaking market, is you'll have this idea and it becomes very popular. And the year that you have that idea, you're very sought after, and people can get into a rut. And then the question very reasonably is, well, what's new? What have you done that's more recent? And if the answer is nothing, well, that's a problem. So I definitely think there's a need to keep fresh, on top of trends, keep on top of what's changing in the environment, even if you're just basically running business for yourself.
And how do you find the kind of best way to apply that? So for someone listening right now, they might get that concept of, okay, you have to stay fresh. Does that require just reading books and reading multiple newspapers and blogs? Or like, what is for you the best practice? If someone came to you and said, okay, Rita, I want to make sure that I'm staying at the cutting edge. I want to be able to see around the corner before I start turning. I want to create that kind of advantage in my business. What would you tell them? What would be maybe some advice that you might offer them so they could start to actually put that into practice?
Well, this is actually a topic I talk about in chapter 1 of my new book. And the book is literally called Seeing Around Corners.
There we go. Love it.
Yeah. And in chapter 1, I borrow a page from Andy Grove's playbook. And as you may recall, he was this very well-known CEO of Intel.
Right.
And he wrote a great book back in the 90s called Only the Paranoid Survive. And in that book, he said, if you want to know where spring is going to most make itself manifest, you have to go to the periphery because that's where it's most exposed. And the way I would talk about that is snow melts from the edges. And by that, I mean, you need systematic ways of getting out to the edges and looking at what's happening, right? So, and that can take a variety of forms. Clearly getting out of the building, right? When you're not sitting at your desk is not going to help with things. I think having diversity in the people that you regularly come into contact with. So are you talking to people who aren't all just like you? Are you engaged with organizations that might introduce you to a diversity of experiences? What are you doing to learn about, some of the new technologies? How are you following up on that? Certainly reading is good. And I think just the principle that you need to devote time to learning and to absorbing rather than to just doing your work is really important. And then there's a whole issue about keeping your skills fresh, right? So if I were to think about just something really simple like the marketing environment today versus, say, 10 years ago, it's a completely different animal. We've got social now. We've got all kinds of practices around data collection, which, however you think about it, it certainly has made a big change. We've certainly gone mobile. We've seen a lot of things shift, even in the last 10 years. So how are you making sure that you're fresh and on top of that? And the last thing is really, are you regularly getting feedback from your peers, from your environment, that'll help you to improve? Your audience is probably likely successful people. And one of the troubles with being a successful person is that people either won't give you feedback or don't think you want it, or you yourself don't realize you need it. And really the only way to improve is to get that feedback from the external environment.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really great advice. One challenge that people may face in trying to apply that or even just really take that in is there's a lot there. I mean, there's a lot that you just kind of offered in terms of different directions and ways that people can absorb or try and attain that knowledge, that information, developing their skills. How have you been able to apply that in your own business and life where there are a lot of different places that you can go to get that information or different ways that you can take it in, but doing it in a way that you don't become overwhelmed? And I think also because we have so many options these days, it's like the shiny object syndrome, right? Of just different opportunities that come our way. How do you ensure that you're not just grabbing at the next shiny object that comes your way and ensuring that you're still benefiting from focus?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm a big beginning, middle, and end person. So when I take a project onto my agenda, I really think about how it's going to go from where it is to where it needs to be to get to closure on it. I think the first thing is to be fairly disciplined about your priorities, right? And what I observe a lot of people doing is they just let themselves get chased around by their own email. And there comes a point when you have to say, this is really important, it deserves my personal and immediate attention. And, these other things are not that they're unimportant, but I don't need to personally be dealing with them right now. So I think there's a whole piece about making those prioritization judgments. When it comes to big commitments, like should I accept a speaking engagement or not, or should I take on a new client or not, I actually have a scorecard that I use. And what I do with that is go through all the different things that come into play. So how much of my time is it going to take? Does it involve like a huge amount of travel? Is it something that I just find really intrinsically, or is it on topic or not? And you can set a little scorecard up for yourself and then just compare different activities against each other in that scorecard. And what you'll find is a couple of things. First of all, there's no perfect opportunity. There's always problems with something. Secondly, is that there's usually a cutoff. Like if you accept to do something and it falls below a certain level, chances are it's something you would have preferred not to be doing. And so becoming more aware of that, I think is helpful. It just speeds up the whole process. And then the last thing is I'm very lucky. I'm in a profession where I basically get paid to think, which is awesome. And so as I'm preparing for speeches or courses or writing, there's a lot that naturally I come across that keeps me in conversation about what are the latest things that are happening.
Right. So you talked a little bit about the different opportunities that we all have these days around being able to acquire clients, and whether it's social or in different kinds of media, just different tactics, channels, and so forth. For you, as you made that transition from the role you were in before into actually launching your own business, what did you find was the best path to actually being able to get clients? And was that a challenge for you at any point, or did it just things kind of click nicely into place?
Well, by the time I was spending substantial time on my own business, I already had books written and lots of articles. I already had a reputation for work in this particular area. So that makes it much easier, obviously, if you're known for something and being an expert in something that is unusual. And I think that body of work made it relatively easy. And plus, I work at a university, so people come to us. So I think from a cold start, you have to be able to answer the question, why would someone come to you? If you sent them an email and said, let's have lunch or something, would they say yes? And then why would that be? And I think people have to be kind of clear about that in their own minds. I don't know about you, but I get an awful lot of, oh, could we have lunch? Could we have coffee? Could I like to pick your brain? Blah, blah, blah. And, I'll say to people, well, okay, tell me what you want to talk about. Oh, I just like to pick your brain. Well, have you read anything I've ever written? Oh, no. Well, why don't you do that? And, it's not that I'm not willing to help. It's just help yourself first. You do your homework before you start asking for people for time.
Well, I think what you just mentioned there is really important, right? Because I've also observed that. And I find that when you push back in a playful and respectful way to people and just saying, listen, tell me more about why you want to meet or how I can help, probably 50% or more will then not respond. It's like they were just kind of interested, but they weren't really committed. They weren't very serious. And so the moment you just push back a little bit and actually require them to do a little bit of work, they tend to kind of disappear. So it's a nice way to qualify people out and actually make sure that you're spending your time wisely.
Well, yeah. And, I think most of us want to be helpful, right? So, and when I was younger, my instant answer would be yes. And then, you can clutter up a whole week very quickly with coffees and meetings and lunches with people who you barely know. So, and again, some of that may be very helpful. Like I had lunch the other day with somebody who is part of this really cool kind of incubator organization. And I learned so much. It was fabulous. So I'm not saying turn everybody down and just don't be accessible, but the kinds of conversations that you don't want to have are either where they're not really completely sure of what I do anyway, so they don't even know what to ask, or they're coming in and it's clear that either they've mixed up who I am or what I do, and they just haven't done the work to prepare. So, I think it's a really important thing. I think with clients as well, because I think what a lot of consultants who just start out do is they get these meetings, right? And they think, oh, the goal is this meeting. And once I got this meeting, then it's naturally going to progress to the next big thing.
I think that's a really good point. With the benefit of hindsight now, Rita, if you kind of, look back over your career to this point, what do you see as maybe being one of the greatest lessons that you learned? And some people might have looked at it, and maybe you even looked at it at that time as a mistake or a real big challenge that seemed insurmountable. But now looking back on it, you recognize that it was maybe a pivotal time or just a really important moment that if you would have known how to deal with it beforehand, you could have avoided it or benefited from it a different way. What kind of stands out to you?
Well, in any career, I think you have to decide which are the things that are your true path versus which you think is appropriate. So I'll give an example. Like if you were going to work for a consulting firm or a law firm or something, right? The Kool-Aid you would have been drinking for many years is that, nirvana is to become partner. And I think one of the things that as I moved through my career is, did I want to just confine myself to basically academic work, or was I more interested in having an impact in the world? And I think the answer came back, well, I was a little more interested in having an impact in the world. Not that I don't respect and think the academic work is super important, because it is, but my skill set seems to be to take that theory and those ideas and be able to frame them in such a way that people can actually apply. And as I worked through my career, that clearly became what I felt really jazzed about. So I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for. It wasn't like a super big setback or anything. It was more of a realization that this is where I really preferred to take things. But that shifts your priorities again, right? That means.
Did you encounter any big setbacks or any challenges? Like I remember one time when I was in Japan building our business over there, there was one moment where like I just thought things were going to blow up, and I really started questioning why I was here and, was I really cut out for this? Like for me, it was a moment that I still remember to this day, even though it's a decade plus later. Is there anything like that that just stands out for you as a challenging time or something that you kind of came up against?
Oh, sure. I mean, any career is full of false starts and missteps and mistakes that people forget about afterwards. But I think that's normal for anybody. Yeah, I think probably the first most challenging thing was in the PhD program. To put it in context, I'd been managing a group. I was pretty young, but I'd been managing a group for about 8 years by that time and was working in the management department. And, could be forgiven for thinking I maybe knew a thing or two about management. But when I started taking these PhD courses and reading the academic literature, it was awful. I mean, just awful. I didn't know anything. I felt every conversation had sort of begun before I got there, and was going to begin afterwards. And I remember sitting in the library at Wharton, banging my way through this article by John Child, who subsequently became quite a good friend. And what Child's article was about was called something like strategic choice. And his whole thesis was that the decisions that managers make matter to organizational outcomes. And I have to tell you, as I was reading this thing, I'm thinking to myself, well, that's blitheringly obvious. Like, why would I be here getting this degree if I didn't believe that? And it took probably 1.5 years to 2 years before you it's like becoming a monk, right? You have to learn the rituals and you have to learn the language and you have to learn the incantations and how things are done. It's a tough learning curve. It really is. I had a master's of public administration, but I didn't have a disciplinary degree like economics or something like that. So I really had to just throw myself into it. And, blessedly, I had a really fantastic chairman, fantastic advisor. And my chairman was great, and they really helped me learn the ropes. But, oh my God, those first 2 years were really tough. Plus, my daughter was 2, and our son was maybe 4. So I had all that going on too. So, it was a tough couple of years.
For sure. On your consulting page on your website, you list 2 main offerings in addition to the speaking, which I know is a big part of what you do in addition to teaching. But you list on that page engagements, and then the second is workshops and webinars. Do you find most buyers start by hiring you for speaking, and then that leads to a workshop, and then that leads to a larger engagement? Or what does the kind of typical buying process look like in your business?
It's really all over the map. And I've been trying to tease a pattern out of it for years. And, the things you go into that you think are like just one-off and, okay, I'll give a nice speech. And, they can turn into endless engagements. And then some of the things you think, oh, this really is going to be a lot of work for whatever reason. Management changes, or they have a change of heart, or the strategy shifts or something. So I wouldn't say there's one clear path to those. Some companies only want the hands-on workshops and so forth. And often I'll bring other people in with me on those kinds of engagements because I just have limited bandwidth. So if it's really like, we'll come into my company once every month and consult with us on getting this particular innovation thing done, for example, would be a very typical one. In that case, I would have a team around me that would do a lot of the project level work. And a typical way that would run is I'd probably be working with the senior team, and then my associates would be working with the actual project level people at the coalface, as it were. So that's a model that does work. The speaking sometimes does turn into follow-on things, and then you just never know.
Well, that's the beauty of business, right? There's always things that just kind of pop out of a place you wouldn't expect them to come from.
It's also fascinating to me to learn how people find me, because you would have thought by now there'd be one path. And again, it could be, oh, I saw you quoted the New York Times, or, oh, there was this interview that was done with you, or, oh, I ran across this video that you did like 4 years ago. It's interesting. I think for most of your audience, it's getting that alignment between the person with an issue that they could use some help with and the budget and the timing, and getting those three things lined up together is not always easy.
I think that takes us beautifully into the next question that I had for you, which is that many consultants feel overwhelmed by client work and then having to market and build their own business. But you speak, you teach, you write, you create videos. I mean, there's a lot of books and blogs and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot that you're doing. And we've seen this in our own business too, how important it is to have different types of media. So whether it's like a YouTube channel or this podcast or article content, speaking lots of different things, because different people consume information in different ways and they find you in different ways. But really what I want to ask you is around productivity, right? You have a lot going on. How do you approach productivity or kind of set your day or your week to ensure that you're able to maintain high levels of performance and really get a lot done?
Well, I think the first thing to realize, it's not me all by myself doing all this stuff. I have a team around me. So Pam, whom I'm sure you've worked with, handles scheduling. And so I think people need to be realistic about there will come a time in your business, if you're successful, where you just cannot keep on top of everything. And what I find with a lot of younger consultants or people that are just starting out, the thought of actually spending money on someone to help them with stuff, they're very reluctant to do that because, oh my God, that's money out of my pocket. And you really can't look at it that way. You have to be looking at it as an investment in building your business. And so I think that's the first thing to realize, which is you're never going to be able to handle all the details yourself. The second thing is to realize that there are going to be some things you're just not good at, right? Like to have someone who does your billing, for example. I mean, unless you're the sort of person who just gets a charge out of Excel spreadsheet, you really can't afford to get somebody to do that for you. So I think the first thing is figuring out what is it that you're doing that you really don't need to be doing. And that hones you in then on, well, what then are the things that only you can do? And I think getting clarity around that is a good first step. I think the second thing is managing your own agenda, right? So what are the 5 or 10 things that are right at the top of my agenda that I really have to address? And what are some of the things that, given all the other pressures on me, it's sort of must do, right? Nice to do. And if I have time, that's kind of the categorization. And then I think also being willing to say no to some things. And again, I'm a pretty positive person. The fact that I'm here, right? I'm able to say yes to things. But there's also some things where, honestly, I really don't need to do that, or that just isn't going to be as great for me as something else. So for another one, like early in your career, you'll get a lot of these opportunities to give free speeches, right? And when you're just building up your book of business, that may indeed make sense. But what you'll find is that people are very happy to waste your time without being willing to compensate you for it if you don't start putting some rules around that stuff. So there comes a point when that isn't as valuable as it might have been at one point. And so knowing when to make those transitions in your career, I think, matters too.
Right. Really good advice. Rita, I want to thank you again for coming on and sharing with us here today. I also want to ensure that people can learn more about you and your work, and especially your books, because you have several of them that people would, I think, gain and benefit a lot from. What's the best place for people to go to learn more about you and your work?
That would be my website, very creatively named ritamcgrath.com. I also will make a plug for the new book, Seeing Around Corners, which will be out in September of 2019.
Looking forward to it. That'll definitely be on my list. Rita, thank you again so much. We'll have everything linked up here to Rita's website, the books as well in the show notes. Just head on over, search for Rita or hit the podcast page. You'll find it there. Thanks again, Rita.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.